I was halfway through my lunch break at work when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw Maya's name. I smiled. She usually texted me during the day, never called unless it was urgent. Maybe Hannah had finally managed to roll over for the first time. Maybe she wanted to tell me about a cute thing our daughter did. I picked up. "Hey love, what's?" Her voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. "Why do you always leave our baby with your sister?" I froze. The sharpness of her words sent a jolt through my body. My hand clenched around my fork. "What?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you talking about?" Maya exhaled sharply, frustration crackling through the line. "Don't play dumb, Ryan. I just got off the phone with your mother. She says Sienna's been watching Hannah every day. Every day." I nearly dropped my fork. "What? Our baby is sleeping at home?" Silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Maya said, "What?" I could hear it now, the shift from anger to confusion. She was just as lost as I was. But the difference was that she had received the accusation. I was still trying to catch up, trying to make sense of words that had no place in my reality. I stood abruptly, chair scraping against the tile floor of the office break room. I walked out, needing space, needing air. "Maya," I said, my heartbeat in my throat. "What exactly did my mom say?" "She called me," she said, her voice tight. She sounded off. Not mad, not accusing. Just disappointed. She said she didn't want to interfere, but she thought I should know. That Sienna has been taking care of Hannah almost every day. That it's been going on for nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks? I ran a hand through my hair. "Maya, listen to me. I have no idea what she's talking about. You know I wouldn't do that. Why would I? It doesn't even make sense." Maya let out a shaky breath. "I know. That's why I called you. Because none of this makes sense." I try to think, try to piece it together. "Are you sure Mom said our baby? Not someone else's? Maybe there's been a mix-up." "She said Hannah. She used our daughter's name, Ryan." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "Maya, look at Hannah right now. Is she there?" "Yes," she said immediately. "She's sleeping in her crib. I just checked on her." That sent a chill down my spine. "Okay," I said slowly. "So if Hannah is home with you, then who the hell is Sienna watching?" Maya didn't answer, but she didn't have to, because we both knew that we were staring at the same abyss, the same question hanging between us like a blade. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a mix-up in words. Something was very, very wrong. I swallowed, my throat dry. "I need to call Sienna." Maya's voice was firm. "I'm calling her first." And she hung up. I stood there for a long time, my phone still in my hand, my mind racing. The logical part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation. That maybe Mom had misunderstood something. That maybe Sienna was babysitting for a friend and somehow, wires got crossed. But the deeper part of me, the part that had lived long enough to know that life was rarely that simple, felt something else. Dread. Something was wrong. And I had this sick feeling that whatever it was about to get worse. I paced the break room, my mind spinning. My wife, Maya, had just called in a mix of fury and confusion, demanding to know why our daughter, Hannah, had been left with my sister, Sienna, every day. The problem? Hannah was home with Maya, fast asleep, which meant my sister was taking care of a baby she believed was ours, but wasn't. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Maya. I answered before the first ring ended. "Sienna just told me she has been watching a baby," she said, breathless, as if she had run across the room. "She says she's been taking care of Hannah for almost 2 weeks. "That's impossible," I shot back. "Hannah is literally at home with you." "I know, Ryan. That's what I told her, but she sounded just as confused as we are. She said Dad brought the baby over and told her I was struggling with Hannah, that she should help out." I stopped pacing. My blood ran cold. "My dad?" I echoed. "Yes." I clenched my jaw. "I don't like this, Maya. Not one bit." Maya exhaled sharply. "Me neither." I pressed my fingers to my temple, trying to fight off the pounding headache that was forming. My dad wasn't the kind of man who did things without a reason. He was calculated, strategic, and a damn good liar when he wanted to be. A bitter taste formed in my mouth. Maya, did Sienna say anything else? She said she was about to call me, Maya replied. Apparently, she was starting to feel weird about the whole thing. She thought it was strange that I never checked in, that I didn't even call to thank her. She figured maybe I was exhausted and didn't want to bother me, but she should have said something, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I know, Maya said, but she was trying to be considerate. She thought we knew. She thought you knew. I swore under my breath. Ryan, Maya said, her voice dropping to a lower, almost scared tone. If Hannah is here, and Sienna has been taking care of a baby thinking it was her, then who is that baby? The words sent an eerie chill down my spine. I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. Maya's voice turned firm. I'm going over there. Wait, I said immediately. No, not alone. She sighed, exasperated. Ryan. No, I repeated. Listen, I know you're upset, and I know you want answers, but this has my dad written all over it. And when he plays games like this, it's never simple. Maya hesitated. She knew I was right. I'll leave work now, I said. I'll meet you at Sienna's house. Do not go inside until I get there. She sighed again. Fine, but hurry. I was already grabbing my jacket. The drive to Sienna's house felt like the longest one of my life. My mind raced through every possibility. Had my dad stolen a baby? No, that didn't make sense. If he had, why would he bring it to Sienna, of all people? And why tell her it was ours? Unless, my stomach twisted. Unless he had a personal stake in this. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I pulled up to Sienna's house just as Maya did. She barely waited for me to park before getting out of her car. I met her at the walkway, grabbing her hand to stop her from charging inside. Her dark eyes flashed. Ryan. I know, I said. Let's go. We stepped inside. Sienna stood in the middle of her living room, her face pale. Ryan, she breathed, eyes flicking between me and Maya. Oh my God. And then I heard it. The soft, delicate sound of a baby's whimper. My heart nearly stopped. I turned my head. A bassinet sat near the couch. Inside it was a tiny infant, bundled in a soft pink blanket. I felt Maya's grip on my arm tighten. Oh my God, she whispered. Sienna stepped forward. Ryan, I swear, I thought she was Hannah. She looks like her. I swallowed, my throat dry. She was right. The baby did look like Hannah, but she wasn't. Where did Dad say he got her? I asked quietly. Sienna's lip trembled. He just dropped her off. Said Maya needed help, that I shouldn't bother her. I wanted to call, but he insisted you both knew. I didn't think he'd lie about something like this. Maya let go of my arm and stepped forward, staring at the baby. And you really never questioned it? Sienna shook her head, shame coloring her features. I figured babies' faces change fast. I thought maybe she looked a little different, but I never imagined. She trailed off. The baby let out a tiny coo. I turned to my sister. Where is Dad now? Sienna swallowed. I don't know. He comes by every night to take her back to you. Or at least, that's what I thought he was doing. My breath hitched. Maya turned to me, horror on her face. Ryan, if my dad was taking the baby somewhere else every night, then where the hell had this child been going? A fresh wave of cold terror washed over me. I turned back to the bassinet, staring at the sleeping baby, and whispered the question we were all thinking. Who are you? My eyes were locked on the baby lying in the bassinet. She looked so much like Hannah. The same soft curls, the same tiny nose. But I knew in my gut this wasn't my daughter. Maya stood beside me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her breath coming in sharp, measured inhales. She wasn't speaking, but I could tell she was barely holding herself together. Sienna, on the other hand, looked like she was about to fall apart. She had taken a step back from us, her hands trembling at her sides. I swear, she stammered, looking at Maya. I thought she was yours. Dad brought her to me, and he was so certain. I never imagined he would lie about something like this. Maya turned to her, her voice dangerously calm. And you never thought to double-check with me? Sienna flinched. I let out a slow breath, trying trying to keep my emotions in check. All right, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. Let's focus on what we do know. I turned to Sienna. You said Dad has been coming here every night? She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. And he takes the baby somewhere, I continued. Where? I don't know, she admitted. He always says he's taking her back to Maya. Maya let out a bitter laugh. Right. Because I definitely wouldn't notice if I suddenly had a different baby in my house. Sienna swallowed hard. I wanted to call, I did. But he was so insistent. He said you were exhausted, that you didn't want anyone to disturb you, that you were trusting me to handle things. Her voice cracked. I believed him. I exhaled through my nose, my fingers tightening into fists. Where is he now? I asked. Sienna shook her head. I don't know. He usually comes around this time, but sometimes he's late. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 7. Then we wait, I said grimly. Maya and I sat down on the couch, while Sienna stood awkwardly near the bassinet. The baby stirred but didn't wake. I could hear the tension in the room, the unspoken accusations, the fear, the what the hell is going on lingering in the air like a storm cloud. Minutes ticked by. Then the sound of tires rolling over gravel reached my ears. I exchanged a glance with Maya. Sienna sucked in a sharp breath. He's here. A car door slammed shut outside. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the door. Maya stood up, her entire body rigid. I rose beside her, jaw clenched. Sienna hesitated, then quickly scooped up the baby. She held her close as if, after everything, she was suddenly afraid of what was about to happen. The front door opened, and there he was, my father. He stepped inside, pulling off his coat like it was just another night, like he wasn't hiding something monstrous. But the moment his eyes landed on me, standing beside Maya, his entire body stiffened. Ryan, he said, masking his surprise with a forced smile. Didn't expect to see you here. I didn't smile back. Yeah? Well, we need to talk. His eyes flicked to Sienna, then to the baby in her arms. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something. But for the first time in his life, he looked unsure. Sienna, who had been silent, finally spoke. Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking. Who is this baby? My father inhaled slowly. Then he let out a small chuckle. Like this was funny. Maya stepped forward, her patience snapping. What the hell is going on? He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Look, I can explain. Then explain, I snapped. Because as far as I can tell, you've been lying to all of us. And I want to know why. My father looked at the baby, at Maya, then back at me. Then, in a quiet voice, he finally spoke the words that would change everything. She's mine. Silence. It crashed over the room like a wave, suffocating, crushing. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I could feel Maya's sharp inhale beside me. And Sienna. She was clutching the baby tighter now, her entire body trembling. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Yours? My father swallowed hard. Yes. A bitter laugh escaped Maya. You mean to tell me that this whole time, you had an affair, baby, and instead of coming clean, you just dumped her on Sienna and lied? His face was unreadable. I didn't lie. Sienna let out a sob. Yes, you did. My father had the nerve to look offended. I was going to tell you all eventually. I took a slow step forward. No, you weren't. He didn't argue. I turned to Maya. She was shaking her head, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold everything together. Sienna, on the verge of tears, whispered, I took care of her. I held her. She broke off, shaking her head. I thought she was Hannah. The betrayal in her voice was unbearable. I looked back at my father. You manipulated us, I said, voice low. You used Sienna. And you would have kept this up for how long? He shrugged. I did what I had to do. Maya scoffed. What you had to do? He met her gaze, unflinching. The baby's mother wasn't ready to raise her. She didn't want anything serious with me, and she couldn't afford to care for her. So, I stepped up. Maya let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Stepped up? You mean you tricked your own daughter into raising your other daughter? Sienna choked on a sob. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. You don't get to play the good guy here, I said. You don't get to act like you're some noble father doing the right thing. For the first time, my father's expression faltered. I exhaled slowly, my voice deadly calm. You don't get to decide when this truth comes out. Maya straightened beside me, her anger burning bright. Because we are going to tell Mom. Sienna sniffled, wiping her eyes. And she's going to leave you. For the first time that night, my father actually looked worried. The weight of my father's confession pressed down on the room like a storm cloud about to break. She's mine, he had said, like it was nothing. Like it was just another piece of information casually dropped into conversation. Maya was standing beside me, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Sienna was still holding the baby, but now she looked like she wanted to let go, as if the weight of my father's lies had finally hit her, and she couldn't bear to hold the proof of his deception any longer. And my father? He just stood there, calm, unapologetic. Maya was the first to break the silence. You're disgusting, she whispered. My father tilted his head slightly, as if her words amused him. Maya, don't say my name, she snapped, stepping forward. Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this. I watched him carefully. He wasn't panicking, not yet. He was assessing the situation, trying to figure out how much damage control he needed to do. That was always his way. He never reacted emotionally. He calculated. I wasn't going to give him that luxury. You lied, I said, voice low. You tricked Sienna into taking care of your child. You let Mom believe she had a granddaughter she hadn't even met yet. And you had the audacity to think you could keep this up? My father finally sighed, shaking his head. I did what I had to do. Maya let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You keep saying that like it justifies anything. He spread his hands, like this entire situation was some unfortunate misunderstanding. The baby's mother wasn't ready to raise her. She needed time, and I didn't want the child to end up in foster care. Sienna's voice, quiet and broken, cut through the conversation. You let me believe she was Hannah. My father turned to her, his expression softening. Sienna, Don't, she said, shaking her head. Don't even try. Tears welled up in her eyes. I took care of her. I held her, fed her, rocked her to sleep, all while thinking she was my niece. Her voice cracked on the last word. I thought I was helping my brother and his wife. I thought I was needed. My father let out a slow breath, as if the conversation had finally begun to exhaust him. Sienna, I knew you'd do the right thing. You've always been responsible. Maya turned to me, disbelief in her eyes. Ryan, do you hear this? Do you hear how casual he is about this? I did, and it made my blood boil. I took a step toward him. Where is Mom? My father's expression hardened slightly. She's resting. She doesn't know yet. Sienna let out a shaky breath. She's going to. He turned to her, his calm exterior finally cracking. Sienna. No, her voice was firmer now. She deserves to know, and she deserves the truth. He ran a hand down his face, and for the first time, he actually looked tired. You don't understand what you're about to do. Maya scoffed. Oh, I think we understand perfectly. I stepped closer, my voice lowering. You don't get to control this anymore, Dad. You don't get to decide when and how the truth comes out. His lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was calculating his next move, trying to regain control. But this time, he was outnumbered. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made everyone freeze. A moment later, my mother appeared at the top of the staircase, her robe tied loosely around her, her eyes bleary with sleep. What's all the yelling? She murmured. I saw the exact moment she took in the scene before her. The way her gaze flicked to me, then to Maya, then to Sienna, who was still holding the baby, and finally, her eyes settled on my father. She didn't say anything for a long time, but I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She already knew. She just didn't want to believe it. My father turned to her, his voice carefully measured. Go back to bed. She ignored him. Instead, she looked at the baby again, and then at Sienna. then back at him. "This isn't Hannah, is it?" she asked quietly. Sienna swallowed hard. "No." Mom closed her eyes for a brief second. Then, without looking at my father, she said, "Whose baby is she?" My father shifted, but before he could open his mouth, Sienna spoke. "She's his." My mother didn't react at first. She just stood there. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then she let out a soft breath, barely more than a whisper. "You promised." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "You promised me," she repeated, looking at my father now, her gaze burning with something I had never seen before. "I know," he said, his voice gentle, "and I'm sorry." She shook her head. "No, you're not." Maya took a step forward. "Mrs. Callahan, My mother held up a hand, silencing her. Then she turned to Sienna. "And you?" Sienna's eyes widened. "Mom, I didn't know. I thought." Mom nodded once, then turned back to my father. "3 years ago," she murmured, "I forgave you because you promised me it was over, that you had made a mistake, and that it would never happen again." She looked down at the baby, then back at him. "You lied." For the first time since we had walked into this house, my father had nothing to say. Silence stretched between them like a canyon. Then, without a single word, my mother turned and walked back up the stairs. A moment later, we heard the bedroom door click shut. No screaming, no throwing things. Just quiet, suffocating devastation. Maya exhaled slowly, running a hand down her face. "Jesus." Sienna was biting her lips so hard I thought she might draw blood. My father just stood there. I stared at him, my stomach churning. He knew this would break her, and he did it anyway. I clenched my jaw. "You should leave." My father glanced at me, something unreadable in his eyes. But for once, he didn't argue. He just nodded, picked up his coat, and walked out the door. No goodbyes, just the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then I turned to Maya. And just like that, we weren't dealing with a mystery anymore. Now, we were dealing with a broken family. And the damage my father had done? That would never be undone. The door shut behind my father, but the silence he left in his wake was deafening. None of us moved. None of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on all of us like an unbearable force. I turned to Sienna. She was still holding the baby, her grip on the child almost desperate, like she wasn't sure what to do now that she knew the truth. Her hands trembled, and I could see the war of emotions playing out on her face. Betrayal, heartbreak, guilt. Maya was beside me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her breathing measured, controlled. But I knew my wife well enough to recognize when she was barely holding it together. And my mother? My mother was upstairs, behind a closed door, shattering in silence. I clenched my jaw, my mind racing. My father had been having an affair for years. He had promised my mother it was over, and she had believed him. She had forgiven him. And now, standing in this house, looking at this baby, we all knew the truth. He had never stopped. He had lied to her, to all of us. And he had been so sure he could keep his deception going indefinitely. But it was over now. Sienna's shaky voice cut through the silence. What do we do now?" It was such a simple question, but none of us had an answer. Maya let out a breath, rubbing her temple. "I don't even know where to start." Sienna swallowed hard. "What about Mom?" I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "She needs time, but she will leave him." Maya nodded, her expression still dark with fury. "And when she does, we'll be there for her. He doesn't get to walk away from this thinking he can manipulate her again." I turned back to Sienna, my voice gentle now. "And you, are you okay?" She let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. "No, Ryan. I'm not okay. I spent 2 weeks taking care of his mistress's baby, and I did it thinking I was helping you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I feel like an idiot." I stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not an idiot. He manipulated you just like he did the rest of us." She sniffled, nodding but still looking unconvinced. I can't believe he used me like that." Maya sighed. "We all believed what we wanted to believe. He knew that." Sienna's arms tightened around the baby. What about her? Her voice cracked. She's innocent in all of this. I glanced at Maya, who crossed her arms. She has a mother somewhere, she murmured. A mother who either trusted your father too much or didn't care what happened to her daughter. I frowned. Sienna, did Dad ever mention the mother? Did he say anything about where she was? Sienna hesitated. Not really. Just that she was working a lot and needed help. Maya scoffed. Oh, please. That man couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it. She probably doesn't even know where her baby's been. The thought made my stomach churn. A mother, somewhere out there, possibly desperate for answers, while my father played house with her child. We need to find her, I said firmly. Sienna bit her lip. And then what? Maya looked at the baby, something softening in her gaze. Then we tell her the truth, and we let her decide what happens next. The words settled between us like a quiet, steady resolve. This wasn't just about what we had lost, our mother's trust, our belief in our father. It was also about making sure the damage he had caused didn't spread even further. Sienna nodded slowly. Okay. I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. We should go. Maya glanced at the stairs. What about your mom? She needs space, I said. Let's give her tonight. Tomorrow, we'll come back. Sienna looked uncertain. Should I stay with her? I hesitated. Only if she wants you to. Sienna nodded, shifting the baby in her arms. And if Dad comes back? Maya's expression hardened. Then he can rot outside. I looked at my sister. You don't have to stay if you don't want to. But she squared her shoulders. I want to. I need to make sure she's okay. I nodded, relieved but also knowing this was going to be harder than any of us wanted to admit. Call me if anything happens. Sienna gave me a small, sad smile. I will. Maya and I turned toward the door, our bodies heavy with the exhaustion of the night's revelations. Before we stepped out, I turned back one last time. Sienna. She looked up. We're going to get through this. She nodded, but her eyes were still filled with hurt. I hope so. We stepped outside into the cold night, the air crisp against my skin. The house behind us no longer felt like home. It felt like the scene of a crime. My father's crime. Maya let out a slow breath, shaking her head. Ryan, I don't think I'll ever forgive him for this. I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Neither will I. And I meant it. Because betrayal like this? It didn't just go away. It didn't fade with time. It left a scar. And my father was about to learn just how deep it would cut. The car ride home was silent. Maya stared out the window, her hands gripping her lap so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every now and then, she let out a sharp exhale, as if trying to release the rage bubbling beneath the surface. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, gripping it just as tightly, my thoughts tangled in a storm of betrayal, disbelief, and pure, raw anger. My father's words replayed in my head. She's mine. That was it. That was all he had to say after years of deceit, manipulation, and lies. No remorse. No shame. He had looked at all of us, his wife, his son, his daughter, and lied to our faces for years. And for what? To protect a secret that was bound to explode the moment someone dared to ask the right questions? I clenched my jaw, my grip on the wheel tightening. Maya finally broke the silence. I hate him. I swallowed. Yeah. Her head turned sharply toward me. No, Ryan, I hate him. I hate that he did this. I hate that he hurt your mom. I hate that he tricked Sienna into raising a baby that wasn't even ours. Her voice cracked. And I hate that he thought he could get away with it. I exhaled, the weight of her words sinking into my bones. Me too. She shook her head, her hands dropping to her lap. What do we do now? It was a question I didn't have an answer to. I pulled into our driveway, cutting the engine. The house was dark, except for the small lamp glowing in the living room window. I turned to Maya. We tell Mom the truth, and we make sure she doesn't let him manipulate her again. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. And if she does? I stared ahead. Then we make sure she knows she has another option. Maya nodded. Good. We got out of the car and stepped inside, The quiet hum of our home a stark contrast to the chaos we had just left behind. The only sound was the faint monitor in the corner, broadcasting Hannah's soft breathing from her crib. I leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over my face. I still can't believe it. Maya sat down at the dining table, her expression dark. Believe it. Your father isn't the man you thought he was. I let out a dry laugh. No, he's worse. Maya's gaze flickered toward the stairs. We should check on Hannah. I nodded, following her up to the nursery. The moment I stepped inside and saw my daughter sleeping peacefully in her crib, my chest tightened. She was so tiny, so innocent. She had no idea what kind of world she had been born into. No idea that her own grandfather had tried to replace her with another baby, weaving a lie so elaborate that even we had almost fallen for it. I crouched down beside her crib, resting my arms on the railing. She deserves better than this. Maya stood beside me, her fingers gently brushing Hannah's blanket. She does. I let out a slow breath. I'm going back tomorrow. Maya tensed. Are you sure that's a good idea? She's my mother, I said. And if I know her at all, she's breaking right now. She needs someone to remind her that she's not alone. Maya hesitated, then sighed. I'll come with you. I turned my head toward her, raising an eyebrow. You sure? Her gaze was steady. If she's going to rebuild, she needs all of us. I reached out, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. I love you. She sighed against my shoulder. I love you too. We stayed there for a while, just listening to Hannah breathe, grounding ourselves in the only thing that still made sense. Our daughter, our family, the home we were building together. But I knew that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, we would return to my mother. And my father? His reign over our family was coming to an end. The next afternoon, Maya and I drove back to my parents' house. I knocked once before stepping inside. Sienna was sitting on the couch, holding a cup of tea between her hands. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. The baby was asleep in the bassinet beside her. She barely glanced up when we walked in. She hasn't come out of her room, she murmured. I swallowed hard. How long? Since last night. Maya frowned. Has she eaten? Sienna shook her head. I don't think so. I exchanged a glance with Maya before heading toward the stairs. I knocked softly on my mother's bedroom door. Mom. No answer. I hesitated before turning the knob. The door creaked open. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when I stepped inside. Her face was unreadable. I sat down beside her, resting my elbows on my knees. Mom. She let out a soft breath. I knew. I frowned. What? She let out a bitter chuckle. I knew he was lying. I just didn't want to believe it. I closed my eyes for a moment, my heart aching for her. Mom. She shook her head. I let him convince me, Ryan. I let him make me think I was crazy every time I suspected something. And now, look at me. I turned toward her. Mom, this isn't your fault. She exhaled. I forgave him once. I swallowed. I know. She looked at me then, really looked at me. And in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Resolve. I won't make that mistake again, she said softly. I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. We've got you. No matter what happens next, we've got you. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't break. She nodded. Maya stepped inside, kneeling beside us. You're not alone. Mom inhaled shakily, then smiled. A small, fragile thing, but real. For the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself believe that we could come out of it stronger, because my father had broken this family, but he would never be able to destroy us. The quiet in my mother's bedroom didn't last long. She wiped her tears, inhaling slowly as if trying to gather every ounce of strength she had left. I saw something shift in her eyes, something firm, something final. I need to leave him, she murmured. I nodded. You do. Maya, sitting beside her, reached for her hand. And when you do, we'll be right here. My mother let out a soft breath, her gaze distant. It's just, after so many years, it feels impossible. I built a life with him, had children with him. And now, all I see is the lie. She turned to me then. But you're right. He's not the man I thought he was. And I can't live like this anymore. I wanted to tell her how proud I was of her for saying it out loud. But before I could, Sienna appeared in the doorway. She looked hesitant, like she didn't want to interrupt, but there was something urgent in her eyes. "Mom," she said softly, "Dad's downstairs." The room tensed instantly. Maya and I stood up at the same time. My mother, however, stayed perfectly still. She closed her eyes for a moment, like she was preparing herself for battle. Then she straightened her shoulders. "Let's go." We followed her down the stairs, moving as a unit, a family stepping into war. My father was standing in the living room, his hands in his pockets, wearing that same unreadable expression he always had when he was trying to manipulate a situation in his favor. But this time, it wouldn't work. When his eyes landed on my mother, something flickered in his gaze. Maybe it was hope. Maybe he thought she would do what she had always done. Listen, forgive, pretend things weren't as bad as they were. He was about to realize just how wrong he was. "Evelyn," he said, taking a step toward her. "Can we talk?" She lifted her chin. "We're talking now." A slight frown crossed his face. He glanced at me, at Maya, at Sienna. "Alone." "No," she said simply. His jaw tightened. "Evelyn, come on. I know you're upset, but let's be rational about this." Maya scoffed. "Rational? You manipulated your own daughter into raising a baby that wasn't hers. You lied to your wife for years. And now you want to talk about rationality?" My father's nostrils flared, but he ignored her. His gaze remained on my mother. "Look, I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this." She crossed her arms. "We? No, you did this. And you can live with the consequences." He exhaled, clearly irritated now. "Evelyn, I know this is a lot, but think about everything we've built." "I did," she interrupted. "And I see now that it was never real. It was all built on your lies." He took another step forward. "I love you." She let out a sharp breath. "No, you love control. You love getting away with things. You love thinking you're smarter than everyone else. But love? No, you don't know what that is." His face darkened, the mask slipping. "You think you're going to leave me? I know I am." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sienna finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Dad, you used me." His eyes flicked to her. "Sienna, No," she said, shaking her head. "I loved that baby. I cared for her. And all this time, I thought I was helping my family. But you? You let me believe a lie. You didn't care about me, about how this would affect me." She swallowed hard, eyes glossy. "I don't think you ever did." For the first time, I saw something crack in my father's expression. "Sienna, I don't want to hear it," she whispered. My father turned back to my mother, desperation creeping into his voice. "Evelyn, let's talk about this. Please." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. And then she said the words that sealed his fate. "You should leave now." His face paled. "Evelyn," he said again. But she didn't move, didn't waver. "You should leave," she repeated, quieter this time, but even more firm. Something in my father seemed to break. For years, he had gotten away with everything. He had lied and deceived, and somehow always kept the people around him under his control. But not anymore. This time, he had lost. And he knew it. His shoulders dropped. He looked at me, at Sienna, at Maya. None of us looked away. He swallowed hard, then slowly turned toward the door. He hesitated for a moment, maybe waiting for someone to stop him, to call him back. No one did. And just like that, he walked out. The door shut behind him, and the house was silent. Sienna let out a slow, shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest like she was trying to steady herself. Maya exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Well," she muttered, "that was a long time coming." I turned to my mother. She was staring at the door, unmoving. I touched her arm gently. "Mom." She blinked, as if snapping out of a daze, then let out a breath. "I'm okay," she murmured, and I knew she meant it. For the first time in years, she was free. The days that followed were quiet, almost eerie in how different they felt. My father didn't try to come back. My mother started packing things slowly, as if shedding pieces of a life that no longer felt like her own. Sienna stayed with her, refusing to leave her alone in that house, and Maya and I visited every day. One evening, while my mother and Sienna were sorting through old photo albums, Maya and I sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee. Maya glanced at me. "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I paused, then exhaled. "Lighter." Maya smiled slightly. "Me too." We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "He's going to try to come back," she murmured. I nodded. "And when he does?" Her gaze was steady. "We won't let him." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "No," I agreed. "We won't." And as I sat there, holding the woman I loved, surrounded by the family I was protecting, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next lie, the next betrayal, the next storm. It was over, and we had one. The first morning without my father in my mother's house felt eerily quiet. Not the kind of silence that creeps in before something terrible happens, but the kind that follows after a storm has passed. A silence filled with the absence of tension, of manipulation, of waiting for the next lie to drop. It was the silence of freedom. Maya and I had stayed over, knowing that even though my mother had made her decision, she might need support in the aftermath. Sienna had refused to leave, too, determined to make sure my mother wasn't left alone in a house that no longer carried the warmth it once did. When I stepped into the kitchen that morning, I found Sienna already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of tea in front of her, staring at nothing. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not really." I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee. The aroma filled the air, but it didn't erase the exhaustion clinging to my bones. I sat down across from her, watching her carefully. "I still don't understand how he did it," she said suddenly, her voice small. I sighed, rubbing my hand over my face. "He was good at lying, and he knew how to get people to believe him." She swallowed hard, looking down at her tea. "I keep thinking about the baby. I held her, Ryan. I fed her. I loved her." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her forehead, closing her eyes. And all that time, she wasn't Hannah. She wasn't ours. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That wasn't your fault." She exhaled shakily. "I know, but it still hurts." Maya's voice came from the doorway. "Because you have a heart, Sienna." We both turned to see her standing there, arms crossed over her chest. She walked over and pulled out a chair beside me. "You're not like him. You actually care about people." Sienna let out a humorless laugh. "Well, that's the problem, isn't it? He didn't care about anyone." A door creaked upstairs, and a few moments later, my mother appeared in the kitchen. She looked lighter. Tired, yes, but lighter. Like the years of being married to my father had finally been lifted off her shoulders. She ran a hand through her hair and gave us a small smile. "Morning." We all murmured our greetings, watching her carefully. She moved toward the coffee pot, but before she could pour herself a cup, Sienna stood up and gently took the mug from her hands. "Sit," Sienna said softly. "Let me get it." My mother hesitated, then nodded, lowering herself into a chair. For a few moments, none of us spoke. Then she said, "I'm filing for divorce today." The words landed like a solid weight in the room. Maya nodded approvingly. "Good." Sienna wiped at her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're really doing it?" Mom let out a breath and nodded. "I should have done it years ago." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring. "I let myself believe his promises. I let myself hope that he would change. But now I see, he never even tried." I exhaled. "He didn't deserve you." She smiled at me, a soft, sad smile. "Thank you, sweetheart." Sienna placed a cup of coffee in front of her. "So, what now?" Mom took a sip before answering. "Now, I move on." The simplicity of the statement hit me hard. For years, our family had been tangled in my father's lies, his betrayals, his manipulations. He had dictated the course of our lives, shaping them with deception. But now, we were taking control back. That afternoon, My mother went to a lawyer's office. She didn't tell my father. She didn't warn him. She didn't even answer his calls. She simply walked into that office and started the process of removing him from her life. By the time she returned home, there was something different in her posture. A quiet strength. A peace that hadn't been there before. She walked into the living room, where we were all gathered. "It's done," she said simply. Sienna let out a small, relieved laugh, covering her mouth with her hands. Maya grinned. I stood up and hugged my mother tightly. "I'm proud of you." She hugged me back just as tightly. "Thank you, Ryan." Sienna sniffled. "So, are we celebrating this?" Mom smiled. "I think we should." And just like that, we did. Not in a grand, extravagant way, but in the way a family does when they've survived something terrible together. We ordered takeout, spread blankets on the living room floor, and watched old movies. We laughed. We talked. We let ourselves enjoy the moment. And for the first time in years, the house felt like home. Weeks passed. Mom found an apartment close to Sienna's. She started redecorating, making the space her own. Sienna, still healing from the betrayal, found comfort in spending time with Hannah. She would come over just to hold her, to rock her to sleep, as if it was helping her process everything she had been through. As for my father, he tried to fight the divorce at first. He called. He showed up at my mother's new place, trying to talk his way back in, but she didn't let him. She was done, and eventually, he realized there was nothing left to manipulate. The last time I saw him, he looked lost, not because he had lost us, but because he had lost control. I didn't feel sorry for him. He had done this to himself, and now he had to live with it. One evening, as I sat in the nursery, watching Hannah sleep, Maya sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "She's going to grow up in a good home," Maya whispered. I smiled, wrapping my arm around her. "Yeah, she is. No more secrets. No more lies. Just love. Just family. Just a new beginning."